This story is called The Back from the Grave Before Dying Paradox and Its Implications, Part 1 of 2, by Scare in a Box on the Scary Stories subreddit. The street was doused in the undulating red and blue lights of 3 parked police cars when Father Matthews pulled up to the curb. The clock on his dashboard read 2:38 a.m. He cut the engine and sat in silence for a few seconds, staring out across the open road. Several uniformed officers were milling around, speaking urgently into radios and directing any bystanders to a safe distance. If any of them noticed him, none looked his way. Blowing out a sigh, Father Matthews climbed out of the car and shut the door behind him. The night was cool. The air was trembling with the promise of rain. A chill wind flapped the edges of his cassock as he began walking towards the police officers, hoping to catch someone's attention. One of them noticed him hovering at the edge of the tape cordon and came over, a young woman with drawn cheeks and a strange look in her eye. "Father Matthews?" she asked with her tone almost cautious. The priest nodded, reaching into the folds of his robe and withdrawing some ID. The woman nodded it away. "Yes, I was called here rather urgently," he said, flicking a look over her shoulder. Her gaze snagged on the house behind her, the only house on the street that sat in the darkness. He looked away, finding her eyes again. "Can you tell me what's going on here?" The officer nodded, gesturing for Father Matthews to follow. "Of course, come this way, and I'll fill you in on the details." He ducked under the tape and followed the young woman across the road. As he walked, he found his gaze being drawn once again to the house, sitting in the middle of the street like a crouched shadow. There's something wrong about it, something disturbing, something he couldn't quite figure out at first glance, but tugged at the back of his mind like a misplaced object. "Approximately 40 minutes ago, I received a call from a woman complaining about someone screaming in the house next door," the young officer began. As they drew closer to the house, the wind picked up, an icy breeze biting straight through the priest's clothes. According to witnesses, a group of young people claiming to be paranormal investigators entered the abandoned property just after midnight. I would assume with the intention of capturing evidence of paranormal activity. She paused, her cheeks adopting a colorless hue. At first I thought it was probably just some young folks messing around, and not actually anything serious, but my colleagues and I came to investigate anyway, and, well, we found this. She pointed towards the house, and Father Matthews laid his full gaze on it for the first time. He blinked, sucking in his cheeks with a sharp breath. Where are all the windows?" The officer shook her head, spreading her hands cluelessly. "No windows, no doors. It's like they just vanished into thin air. But if you listen closely, you can hear them screaming inside. I've never seen anything like it." "Nor have I," the priest whispered, staring at the bricked facade in incredulity. "How could this be possible? If there was a way inside, surely there must be a way out, too." "If we even try to get close," the woman continued, gesturing to herself and the other police officers around her, "it's like something repels us. We don't know how to get inside. That's why we called you. Whatever we're dealing with, we're way out of our depths here." Father Matthews said nothing, contemplating the house in stout silence. A house with no windows or doors and a force that repels any who try to enter. Would he be able to get inside? With the power of God on his side, it may be possible. But who knew? What waited for him within? Those who'd gone inside, those whose screams he could now hear echoing through his brain, would he be able to save them? He turned to the woman and offered her a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll try my best to bring the investigators to safety. But as I'm sure you're aware, I cannot make promises. Whatever's causing this is something deeply evil. It will not be easy." The officer nodded, giving him a solemn look. "Of course. We'll be here as backup if you need us. Good luck in there." The priest looked back towards the house and his smile faded, replaced with a somber frown. He reached for his rosary, folded beneath his cassock, and held it tight, the edges of the cross digging into his palms. "May God give me strength." The police officers watched him with an almost wary reverence as Father Matthews strode up to the house, trying to ignore the prickle of unease on the back of his neck and the anxiety squirming in his chest. This was no place to doubt himself or his faith. The cops were relying on him to do what they could not. He walked right up to the brick wall, fighting against the sickness in his stomach. Something was trying to push him back, but he braced his feet against the ground and held firm. He closed his eyes, clenched the cross in his hand, and began to chant a prayer underneath his breath. All of a sudden, he felt the air shift around him, like a veil parting or an old doorway opening. Without opening his eyes, he stepped forward, trusting nothing but himself. The air immediately turned heavy and stale, and when he opened his eyes, he was no longer standing outside, amid the cold night. He was in the house. First thing that struck him was the silence. All he could hear was his own strained breathing and the clack of the rosary beads in his hand. The screams had completely stopped. What had happened to him? Father Matthews shuddered at the thought. He was standing in a hallway. A worn wooden staircase spiraled away on his left, and the walls plastered with grimy, old-fashioned wallpaper. Everything around him was doused in a strange sepia-colored hue, like he was looking at an old photograph. There was an age-stricken quality to everything, like it had been left to wither away, tainted by the passing of time. It took him a moment to realize where he was. These surroundings were familiar, calling back memories he had long forgotten. He was standing in his childhood home, or at least an uncanny replica of it. He turned back around. The door was there, and the sash windows with the billowy cream curtains. When he peered through the glass, all he could see was darkness, no flashing police cars, just endless gloom. Facing the stairway, he stepped deeper into the house, listening for any other presence beyond his own. He couldn't sense anything human or otherwise. It seemed as if he was the only one here. So where were the investigators? Where is the thing that trapped them here? Still clutching his rosary, Father Matthews walked past the staircase and stepped into the sitting room on the left. The room was also cast in the same eerie sepia pall, making it seem like a crude imitation of his memory, nothing real. The air was thick with dust, making Matthews' mouth go dry. His heart pounded dully in his ears. There was nobody here. Then, out of nowhere, a faint whisper slithered over the back of his neck, like an icy breath cutting beneath his flesh. Welcome. He gave a start, tightening his hand around the rosary, the edge of the cross drawing blood from his palm. He turned and realized he wasn't alone after all. 4 figures stood in the corner of the room, doused in shadow, 3 men and a woman in their early 20s, the paranormal investigators. Father Matthews started towards them, then stopped. A flicker of dread caught in his throat. There's something dreadfully wrong about what he was seeing. The 4 of them stood facing him, but there's some strange look about their faces, something missing. They were too pale, their eyes too sunken. They were looking at him without seeing. In the back of his mind, there was an echo of a memory. He had seen something like this before while examining Victorian death photos taken wherein the deceased are positioned and posed as if alive. These 4 had a similar aura about them. They looked alive, but they weren't. Their arms hung oddly at their sides as if being held by strings, and they didn't blink, just stared that strange hollowness in their eyes. Please, sit. The whispering voice came again. The one on the left moved his lips, but the sound was coming from elsewhere, somewhere behind him. He wasn't the one speaking. He was merely a puppet being controlled by some unseen presence. The woman jerkily lifted her hand, hooking a finger towards the 2-seater sofa. Father Matthews glanced toward it and noticed something sitting on the coffee table, a dagger of sorts with an ornamental handle. He ignored them, staying where he was. One of the men in the middle shuddered and began to move. He lurched forward, his movements clumsy and unrestrained, his head lolling uselessly to the side, his eyes unblinking. It was like watching a doll come to life. There was something eerily disturbing about it. The man drew closer, and Father Matthews swallowed back a cold sense of fear, smoothing the pad of his thumb over the rosary to give him strength. Whatever happened, he would be able to face it. The puppet reached out with pale, mottled hands and pushed the priest towards a chair. The soulless black eyes stared back at him, fingers ice cold and stiff when they touched his back, shoving him with surprising strength. Father Matthews half collapsed into the chair, and the puppet slumped into the one opposite, his jaw hanging open like a hinge. The others watched from the shadows. The priest folded his hands in his lap. What are you, puppeteer of the deceased? He asked, his voice stark against the silence. The puppet in front of him twitched. For a second, it seemed like its eyelids fluttered, deepening the shadows cast over its lifeless gaze. Would you like to know? Said the voice, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, ringing through Father Matthew's skull. There was something familiar about the voice, but he couldn't place it. Perhaps he didn't want to know. That's why I asked, the priest said, never taking his eyes off the puppets. He could hear the sound of bones creaking, joints popping, but none of them moved. I come from a different time, the voice answered. A time ahead. I'm not tied to the same limitations of other hauntings. I can do much more than bang walls and spook children. I'm resourceful. I am powerful. I am the seed of the darkest of hearts. A shudder pinched the back of Father Matthew's neck. Are you the devil's son? The voice laughed, a low, demeaning cackle. No, not quite. I'm you, Father. I'm your ghost from the future. Father Matthews stood sharply, the chair clattering behind him before tipping over. "You lie," he spat, his head spinning. That voice. Surely it couldn't be. "At some point in your life, a secret shall be revealed to you, one that will make you question everything you thought you knew. You will lose your faith in God and in goodness. It will be the start of your downfall." Despite the absurdity of it all, Father Matthews couldn't find it in him to condemn the voice as a liar. What if it spoke the truth? "Did you travel to the past to warn me?" The voice laughed again. The puppet shuddered and twitched, as if the laughter was coming from somewhere deep inside of it, from a darkness growing in its stomach. No. I brought death and despair to so many that it has grown boresome. So, just for fun, I decided to bet my very existence against your force of will." The voice sobered suddenly, growing closer to an echo of Father Matthews. "Pick up the dagger in front of you. I'll give you the choice. You can either destroy yourself and thus prevent my creation, or continue living and set me free so that I might continue to bring misery to this world." Matthews stared down at the dagger, tracing the curve of the blade with his eyes. If he took it now and plunged it deep in his heart, that would be enough to prevent innocent lives from being destroyed. But what if the voice was lying? There was no guarantee that Father Matthews would succumb to darkness or commit these terrible acts. Knowing what he did now, surely that would be enough to stop him from falling down the wrong path. Was that a risk he was willing to take? The priest lifted his gaze to the corpses of the 4 investigators. This was only the start of what his future self was capable of. How many more people would die in the process while he battled this inevitable darkness inside him? With a lurch, the man sitting opposite him fell forward, smashing his head against the table. Father Matthews jumped back, his heart thundering in his chest, as that inhuman laugh echoed in his ears. The other 3 investigators also collapsed, crumpling into a heap of pale, rotten bodies. It was too late for them, but perhaps it was not too late for him. He could get out of this unscathed, but what would that mean for the future? If he simply walked out of here, what sort of darkness would follow him? Matthews picked up his rosary, thumbing the cross as if it might give him the answer. On the table, the dagger glistened in sepia light. All he had to do was take it, stab it deep into his chest, and his future would be certain. This evil ended here with him. Or he could leave and pray that he was strong enough to refute the path of darkness that was so certain in his future. "Tick-tock," the voice whispered, a cold breath touching the back of his neck once more, reminding him he was not alone. So, what's it going to be? By the time Father Matthews left the house, dawn was breaking under a rainy sky, casting a dismal glow over everything. The pavement was wet, muting his footsteps as he walked towards the flashing police cars. The young policewoman from before came rushing to his side. Her eyes bore dark shadows, her cheeks were pale and sunken. She'd been waiting all night. "Is it over?" she asked, flicking a glance towards the house behind him. The windows and doors had returned, but the priest had emerged alone. "Where are the—" She went silent when she glimpsed the haunting look in his eye, the words dying in her throat. "The investigators didn't make it," he said regretfully. "I was too late for them." "But what about the evil? Did you exorcise it?" Father Matthews swallowed thickly, unable to meet her eyes. "Yes, the haunting is gone, but it seems I am destined to meet it again, sometime in my own future. I really hope that next time I'll be stronger than I am today." The woman stared at him in confusion, at his cryptic words, but the priest merely patted her shoulder gently. He began to walk away, but something made him glance back one last time. Silhouetted against the window, a shadow moved quickly out of sight, leaving a flutter of curtains in its wake. Father Matthews clenched his jaw, palming his rosary. The next time he was confronted with the path of eternal darkness, he would be ready. He'd be waiting, and he would not succumb. Thank you for listening. That was The Back from the Grave Before Dying Paradox and Its Implications, written by Scare in a Box and found in the subreddit Scary Stories. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you next time.